She gave her daughter the last piece of bread, then passed out at work. Hours later, a billionaire CEO learned it was the woman he never stopped thinking about. Alexander Blake was used to control. He was a man who scheduled his days to the minute, who never arrived late, and who never noticed much beyond boardrooms, contracts, and private jets. But that afternoon, as he pulled up to the private school where his 6-year-old daughter Emma attended, something out of the ordinary pulled him out of his world of numbers and decisions. He had expected to see her waiting as always, neatly dressed, holding her pink backpack and smiling. Instead, she was sitting on the low stone ledge near the school's front gate, her legs swinging idly as she leaned toward another little girl who was crying quietly. The other girl was clearly not a student at this expensive school. Her clothes were simpler, worn but clean, a light blue dress that was slightly wrinkled, a yellow backpack that looked too big on her small frame. Her long brown hair framed her tear-streaked face as she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Emma sat beside her, not speaking, just offering her a red apple from her lunchbox. The act was so natural, so quiet and unassuming, that Alexander almost missed it. He got out of the car, leaving the door open behind him, and approached slowly, puzzled and concerned. As he neared, Emma looked up at him with her usual calm expression, as if what she was doing needed no explanation. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft but steady, her mommy didn't come to get her. "She's scared to go home alone." The other girl flinched when he got closer, but Emma gently reached out and touched her shoulder as if to say it was okay. Alexander crouched down, leveling himself with the two girls. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, directing the question gently toward the stranger. The girl sniffled and hesitated. "Sophie," she said barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, trying to mask the sudden tightness in his chest. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing a child so young, sitting alone, abandoned in a world that was clearly too big for her. He looked at Emma, then back at Sophie. "Do you know where your mom is?" Sophie bit her lip and glanced down at her shoes. "She got sick at work. Someone said she fainted. An ambulance came. I don't know where they took her." She wasn't crying anymore, just sitting there with that quiet, empty voice children sometimes use when they're trying to sound strong. Alexander didn't know what moved him more, Sophie's small voice or the way Emma instinctively wrapped an arm around her. He stood up slowly, pulled out his phone, and called his driver. In a clipped tone, he gave the man instructions to call nearby hospitals, asking for anyone named Laura King who had been admitted in the last few hours. Then he sat down on the ledge beside the girls. He didn't say much. He just waited with them, one hand resting gently on Emma's shoulder, the other typing names into search engines, listening to the city move around them while two small lives sat quietly, connected by an apple and unexpected compassion. The car ride to the hospital was unusually quiet. Sophie sat in the back seat between Emma and Alexander, clutching her worn yellow backpack tightly to her chest like a lifeline. Her small fingers were trembling, but she didn't cry. Emma, ever intuitive for her age, gently took Sophie's hand without saying a word. Alexander glanced at them through the rearview mirror, a strange heaviness sitting in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't business stress. It wasn't irritation or pressure. It was something deeper, something personal and unfamiliar, like guilt and responsibility twisted together. Earlier, his driver had confirmed that a woman named Laura King had been admitted to Westbrook General Hospital, unconscious from what appeared to be dehydration and overwork. When he heard the name, something stirred in Alexander's memory, but he couldn't place it yet. The moment had been too quick, too far in the past. Now, as they pulled up to the entrance of the emergency department, he saw the sterile glass doors slide open and felt an odd sense of dread. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as the three of them approached the front desk. The receptionist barely looked up until Alexander said the name Laura King. The woman's expression changed almost immediately. "She's conscious now," she said, looking at Sophie with recognition. "You can go in, room 204, straight down the hall to the left." Sophie let go of Emma's hand and hesitated. Her eyes moved to Alexander, as if asking if she was allowed to go. He gave a small nod. Go ahead. We'll be right behind you. Sophie ran. It was the first time Alexander saw her move with anything like confidence, and it was startling. He followed more slowly with Emma beside him, unsure of what to expect. The door to room 204 was slightly ajar, and through it he saw a pale, fragile-looking woman sitting upright in bed, and 4 in her arm. Her hair was dark brown, tied in a loose bun, her eyes tired but alive. When Sophie entered, the woman's face lit up, not with energy, but with relief so deep it was almost painful to witness. She pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tightly, whispering, "I'm okay, baby. I'm here." Alexander stood silently in the doorway. For a moment, he didn't want to intrude. But then the woman looked up, and froze. Her eyes widened. A beat of recognition passed between them, and suddenly he remembered where he had seen her before. Years ago, she had interned in his office. Bright, focused, always staying late and asking thoughtful questions. Her name had passed his desk once when HR circulated a list of staff being let go during a downsizing. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now here she was, frail and exhausted, clinging to a child who had asked strangers for help because she had no one else to call. "Mr. Blake," she asked, voice hoarse but clear. He nodded. "Yes. I found Sophie outside the school. Emma was with her." She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. "I never wanted this. I didn't know who else to ask. I passed out. I haven't eaten properly in days. I couldn't afford to miss another shift, but my body gave up." Alexander stepped into the room and sat on the nearby chair, suddenly unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, but the scene before him made him feel exactly that. "You don't have to explain," he said quietly. "I want to help." She looked at him, tired and skeptical. "Why?" The question hung there like a challenge, like a wall she had every right to put up. He didn't have an answer. Not one that would fit in a sentence. But he looked at Emma, who stood silently beside him, and he looked at Sophie, curled into her mother's arms, and he said, "Because someone has to." Laura didn't say much after that, and neither did Alexander. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with everything that couldn't be easily spoken aloud, her exhaustion, his confusion, the fragile thread that had suddenly connected their lives. The nurses came in and out, checking her vitals, adjusting her making notes. Sophie never left her mother's side. She sat curled against her, eyes alert, as if afraid that if she looked away, Laura might disappear again. Emma stayed close to Alexander, occasionally glancing at him as if trying to understand what was really going on. It wasn't until nearly an hour later, after a doctor confirmed that Laura would be discharged the next day, that Alexander finally stood and quietly asked if he could speak to her alone. Laura looked down at Sophie and gently asked her to go show Emma the coloring book on the table. The two girls walked to the far corner of the room, still in earshot but happily distracted. Alexander sat back down in the chair beside her bed. "I know this probably feels sudden," he began, "and I don't want to overstep anything, but I want to understand what happened. Not just today. The whole picture." Laura didn't answer right away. She looked out the small hospital window, where the sunlight was beginning to fade behind a line of gray buildings. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but firm. "After I lost the internship at your company, I tried to stay in the industry. But no one was hiring someone without a degree and experience. I was juggling part-time classes and 2 jobs. Then Sophie got sick one winter. It was pneumonia. I missed a week of work, and I lost everything. The apartment, the part-time job, and eventually school too. I ended up cleaning offices and waiting tables just to keep her fed. We've been in and out of shelters. I got us a small place now, but it's barely enough to cover rent and groceries." Alexander listened, stunned. He had no idea. She wasn't the kind of person who asked for help. Even now, she told her story without self-pity. She was just stating facts, facts of a life that had unraveled quietly while the world moved on. "I'm not trying to guilt you," she added, as if reading his expression. I've been alone a long time. I didn't think I could expect anything from anyone. Not anymore. I'm not here out of guilt," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And I'm not here just because of Emma. Or Sophie. I'm here because I saw a little girl sharing her lunch with another who had no idea if her mom was okay or not. And I realized I've been living a very small life, in a very big way." Laura turned to look at him then, "Really look. You don't owe us anything." "I know," he said. "But maybe I want to give something anyway." They didn't come to any decisions that evening. He offered to pay for temporary childcare while she recovered. She declined at first but eventually accepted when he explained it came with no strings attached. He didn't even push her to leave the hospital with him. Instead, he left his driver's card, his private number, and promised to check on them in the morning. That night, Alexander sat alone in his penthouse apartment, looking out over the glittering skyline that usually filled him with pride. But now it felt sterile and meaningless. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Sophie had clung to her mother's hospital gown, the quiet way Laura had told him she used to skip meals just to keep her daughter fed. For years he had measured success in profits and mergers. But now he was beginning to suspect that everything he had built meant very little if it couldn't offer safety to someone like them. He thought of Emma, who had acted with more empathy than he had in years, and he wondered, not for the first time that night, if maybe it was time for him to start becoming someone his daughter would be proud to grow up with. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the hospital earlier than he expected. He hadn't planned to come in person, but something pulled him there, a quiet urgency he couldn't quite explain. When he stepped into room 204, he found Laura already dressed in her clothes from the previous day, sitting upright on the bed while Sophie brushed her hair with a plastic comb from a hospital care kit. There was something striking about the scene, how calm it felt, how intimate and vulnerable yet dignified. Laura looked up when she saw him and gave a faint smile, still weary but more composed than she had been the night before. "I didn't think you'd come back yourself," she said quietly, her voice softer in the morning light. "Most people in your position would have sent a car or an assistant. I thought you deserved better than a stranger knocking on your door with instructions," Alexander replied. He glanced down at Sophie, who was now carefully packing up her mother's things into a hospital tote bag. "Besides, I promised I'd check in." He hesitated, then added, "And I keep my promises." Laura stood slowly, clearly still a little unsteady, and reached for the discharge papers on the table. "We're good to go. They cleared me with a warning, I'm dangerously close to full burnout, which I already knew. But at least I have a second chance to fix it." "Not alone," he said, and handed her a folder. Inside were several documents, arrangements for a temporary apartment closer to a good school, a schedule for medical checkups, a recommendation letter from him personally, and a prepaid account for groceries. Laura stared at it without touching it. "I don't want to owe you," she said after a moment. "You won't," Alexander said. "You're not a charity case. This is what people do when they care. And maybe I didn't do enough of that in my life before. But I can now." There was a long pause between them. Sophie looked up and gently placed her small hand into her mother's. "Mommy, can we go with him?" she asked innocently. Laura closed her eyes and nodded, more to herself than to anyone else. Alexander took them first to a quiet cafe near the hospital. It wasn't part of his original plan, but he thought maybe a warm breakfast would help make everything feel more human and less like a transaction. He ordered pancakes for the girls and tea for Laura, sitting across from them in a booth that suddenly felt like the center of his entire day. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't business. It was real. Laura slowly began to open up more. Over scrambled eggs and toast, she told him about the little apartment they had been living in, a studio with one bed and a small heater that broke every other week. She explained how hard it was to get stable work when she had to juggle school pickups and night shifts, and how often she went without meals so Sophie wouldn't have to. Alexander listened to every word, not with the mind of a CEO scanning for numbers or flaws, but as a man trying to learn what he had ignored for far too long. "I've made mistakes," he admitted quietly. "I've built a world that's designed to keep people like me safe from seeing this kind of struggle. Maybe I told myself that was smart. But I see now it's just lonely. And cowardly." Laura didn't respond immediately. She reached for her tea and stirred it slowly, watching the tiny whirlpool form inside the cup. "It's hard to trust," she said eventually. "You've lived in a different world. And even now, I keep waiting for the part where all this disappears." "It won't," Alexander said. "Not unless you ask me to disappear." They left the cafe together later that morning. He walked them to the new apartment, small, but warm, freshly cleaned and already stocked with a few essentials. Laura looked around, speechless, while Sophie ran from room to room, delighted by the simple fact that she had her own space. A real bed. A closet. A window with curtains. Alexander stood by the door, watching them, and felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't just about making amends or being kind. It was about the slow realization that these moments, this family he'd stumbled into, was something he wanted to be a part of, not just support from a distance. Before he left, he knelt down to speak to Sophie. "If you need anything," he said gently, "you call me, okay? Anytime." She nodded, serious and grateful in a way only children can be. And when he looked up at Laura, he saw that her eyes were no longer filled with doubt, but something far more complicated, something close to hope. Over the next few weeks, the rhythm of their lives began to change in subtle but undeniable ways. Laura started her part-time role at Alexander's foundation, a position he created not out of pity but because it was clear she had insight and strength that couldn't be learned in a boardroom. She wasn't just efficient, she was fiercely determined, and more than once, she pointed out blind spots in the foundation's community outreach programs that his top advisors had never even considered. Alexander noticed, and he listened. More importantly, he made sure she knew he was listening, which was something he hadn't done for anyone in a long time. Meanwhile, Sophie and Emma grew closer every day. They attended the same school, sat side by side in class, and became inseparable during recess. Their bond was not just built on friendship, but a quiet understanding of each other's worlds. Emma, raised with every advantage, began to see life from a new perspective through Sophie's eyes. And Sophie, once quiet and cautious, began to laugh more freely and speak with more confidence. At home, the two girls drew pictures together, made messy art projects that cluttered Laura's kitchen counters, and filled the apartment with a sense of childhood that had been missing for too long. Alexander visited often. At first, he told himself it was just to check in, to make sure the transition was going smoothly, that the apartment was functioning, that Sophie had everything she needed. But those check-ins became longer, more frequent. He would bring dinner, sometimes groceries, or small things he thought Sophie might like, a new set of crayons, a storybook about a curious girl who traveled the world, a pair of matching hair clips for the girls. And each time he left, he would find it harder to close the door behind him. One rainy evening, after staying for dinner, Alexander lingered longer than usual. Laura had made pasta, nothing fancy, but warm and comforting, and the girls had fallen asleep in the living room with a movie still playing on low volume. The apartment was quiet except for the rain tapping softly against the windows. Laura stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, while Alexander dried them. The domesticity of the moment struck him. It wasn't something he had felt in years. He had homes in 4 cities, with views that people envied, but not once had he dried dishes with someone while children slept nearby and the world felt paused in a way that invited peace. He broke the silence gently. "You've built a beautiful life, Laura. Even with everything you've faced, you've raised an incredible daughter." Laura paused for a second before replying. It hasn't been beautiful most of the time. It's been hard. Lonely. Some nights, I didn't know how I was going to feed her the next day. I've had to say no to things I didn't want to. I've hated myself for not being enough. But I never stopped trying. He nodded, deeply moved. I can see that. And I think Sophie sees it, too. She's proud of you. Anyone would be. She looked at him then, for a moment too long, and he knew something was shifting between them. The air felt heavier, not with tension, but with the possibility of something neither of them had allowed themselves to hope for. Yet Laura pulled back, emotionally if not physically, and turned away to wipe her hands. I'm afraid of this, Alexander, she admitted quietly. Of you. Of what this could turn into. I don't want Sophie to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, honest. I'm afraid too. But I'm here anyway. I'm not going to disappear. And I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. The quiet returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds unspoken truths, the kind that says maybe, just maybe, there is something real blooming in a place where no one expected it. Before leaving that night, Alexander gently covered the girls with a blanket, looked at Laura once more, and simply said, "Good night." She nodded, watching him go, the sound of the door closing far softer than it had ever been. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to wonder what it would feel like to let someone stay. The following week unfolded like a slow, unexpected tide pulling both Laura and Alexander into something deeper than either of them had planned. The casual dinners turned into routine. Alexander began showing up not just in the evenings but sometimes in the middle of the day with coffee or takeout, or simply. It had been almost 2 months since that rainy evening when Alexander first allowed himself to feel something real again, something grounded not in success or power but in shared moments and quiet honesty. The visits continued, but no longer with the pretense of business. He came because he wanted to be there, because he missed the sound of Sophie's laughter when she told him about her school day, because Emma began to ask if Mr. Blake was coming over for dinner again, and because Laura, though still guarded, had stopped flinching when he offered to help wash the dishes or bring groceries by unannounced. One Saturday morning, Alexander suggested something unexpected, a day trip to the aquarium. It wasn't lavish or extravagant. He rented a modest van, packed snacks with Emma's help, and even brought along 2 extra umbrellas in case the weather turned. When they arrived, Sophie's eyes lit up in a way that made Laura smile so sincerely it stunned him. It wasn't just about the fish or the glowing jellyfish or the massive sea turtles gliding through the water. It was about being treated like a family. About not needing to worry about how much the tickets cost or whether there would be enough money left for lunch afterward. Laura watched Alexander all day. She saw how he knelt down to read exhibit signs with the girls, how he made sure to hold Sophie's hand if they were in a crowd, how he never once made her feel like she owed him anything. But the fear still lingered. She had built so many walls over the past years to protect her daughter, and herself. She wasn't sure if she knew how to let them down without risking everything. That evening, after the girls fell asleep in the back seat during the drive home, Laura spoke without looking at him. "This isn't easy for me. Letting someone in. Trusting again. I've had to carry everything alone for so long, and now, there's you. And I don't know how to let myself want this." Alexander didn't answer right away. He focused on the road, the glow of the dashboard reflecting softly on his face. "I don't want you to rush anything," he said finally. "I'm not asking for answers today. I just want to be someone who shows up. Who stays. And if someday you want more than that, I'll be here." Back at the apartment, he helped carry the sleeping girls inside, carefully laying them in bed without waking them. Laura lingered at the doorway of Sophie's room, arms crossed, watching them breathe. She spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I don't know how long this peace will last. Life has a way of changing everything when you least expect it." He nodded. That's why we don't waste the moments when it's here. The following week brought an unexpected shift. Laura was offered a full-time role at the foundation. Not from Alexander, but from the board itself. Based on the work she had already done, her impact was undeniable. It was a moment of validation she hadn't realized she needed. That evening, after the girls were asleep again, she poured 2 cups of tea and joined Alexander at the small kitchen table. "I'm scared," she said, not dramatically, but plainly. He met her gaze. "So am I. But I'd rather be scared with you than comfortable alone." For the first time, Laura let herself believe that maybe this man wasn't going to vanish. Maybe the world wouldn't fall apart just because she allowed herself to feel something again. As the quiet evening stretched into night, and the girls stirred gently in their beds, something unspoken began to settle between them. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't love declared. But it was a beginning. A real one. One built not on fantasy, but on the quiet, determined act of showing up day after day, for each other, and for the small, hopeful family they were slowly becoming. Spring arrived slowly, painting the city in soft pastels and warmer winds, but for Laura, everything still felt uncertain beneath the surface. There were mornings when she would wake up and feel a quiet panic press against her chest, as if it was all too good to last: the steady job, the peaceful home, Sophie's constant smile, Alexander's growing presence. She had built a life on caution, on survival, on waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now, when there were no shoes dropping and no doors slamming, she didn't quite know how to exist. It scared her more than the chaos ever had. Alexander, meanwhile, continued to show up in quiet, consistent ways. He didn't try to impress or overwhelm her. Instead, he learned what mattered. He remembered the way she liked her tea, the kinds of books Sophie preferred to read before bed, and that Laura never liked surprises, unless they came with pastries. He began to rearrange parts of his schedule, slowly, without making it obvious. Evening meetings became rare. His phone stayed on silent during dinner. Sometimes he would even take Emma and Sophie to the park by himself, just so Laura could have a couple hours alone, something she hadn't experienced in years. But as their bond deepened, so did the weight of unspoken things. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, Laura sat beside him on the small living room couch while the girls played in the hallway. She was quiet, her expression unreadable, until she finally said, "I keep waiting for you to realize this is too messy for you. That we're too messy. That you could walk away and go back to your clean, predictable world and forget all of this happened." Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked, and then said, "I've had clean and predictable. It was empty. This isn't messy to me. It's honest. It's real. And if I ever walk away from that, I'd be more lost than I've ever been." She didn't respond, but her hand found his on the couch cushion and stayed there. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense, not yet. But it was something stronger, a trust slowly forming where none had existed before. That night, after the girls were asleep and the apartment was silent, Laura stood in the kitchen staring out the small window at the streetlights below. Alexander came in to say goodnight, expecting her usual quiet nod, but instead she turned and said softly, "Would you stay? Just for a while. I don't want to be alone tonight." He didn't make a move or say anything suggestive. He just nodded and followed her to the couch, where they sat in silence. At some point, she fell asleep leaning against him, and he stayed perfectly still, afraid that even shifting his weight might break the fragile trust between them. He watched her breathe, her face finally relaxed in sleep, and realized that in all his years of striving, of chasing success and status, he had never felt more grounded than in that quiet room with nothing but the hum of a refrigerator and the soft weight of a woman who had survived far more than he could ever imagine. The next morning, when she woke up and found him still there, already brewing coffee and helping Sophie get dressed for school, something broke open in her. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood in the doorway, watching, and let herself believe that maybe this wasn't temporary. Maybe this was a man who would stay, not because he needed to be a hero, but because he had finally found a place where he could be fully human. By the time summer arrived, the changes in their lives had become part of a quiet new rhythm. What had once felt like coincidence or temporary support now grew into something more stable, more rooted, as if they had been building it all along without fully realizing it. Laura found herself smiling more easily, not out of politeness or necessity but from a real sense of peace. Her job at the foundation continued to evolve. She wasn't just helping with outreach now, but shaping entire projects, particularly those aimed at supporting single mothers and working families. Her story had become the catalyst for programs she never imagined she would one day lead. And Alexander, who had spent most of his adult life measuring value in profit margins and boardroom wins, now found himself watching school plays and helping with homework, discovering a depth of fulfillment that could never be bought or negotiated. Their days became filled with small, meaningful moments. Sunday breakfasts where the girls mixed pancake batter while arguing about which toppings to use. Evenings where Laura would lean against the kitchen counter, sipping tea, while Alexander read to Sophie and Emma on the couch. Weekends at the park, where they laughed like any other family, unnoticed by the world that once felt so distant and unrelatable. And sometimes, at night, when the girls were asleep and the apartment was wrapped in stillness, Laura and Alexander would talk. Not about work or the past, but about fears and hopes and the quiet miracle of how their lives had collided. Slowly, cautiously, their affection deepened. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was solid, built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the simple choice to keep showing up for each other every day. But life, as always, had a way of testing what was real. One afternoon, Laura received a call from a lawyer she hadn't heard from in years. It was about Sophie's biological father, a man who had vanished before Sophie's birth and had never once attempted contact. Now, after all this time, he had filed a motion claiming parental rights. The news hit Laura like a punch to the chest. Not because she feared losing Sophie, she knew she would fight with everything she had, but because it brought back every doubt, every insecurity, every buried fear that she would never be enough. She told Alexander everything that night, pacing the living room while he sat calmly, letting her speak. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it immediately. He just listened, fully, and then stood, walked over to her, and said, "You are not alone. We're in this together." She collapsed into his arms, finally allowing herself to cry. It wasn't just about the legal threat, it was about the years of holding everything together with no one to catch her if she fell. With Alexander's help, she hired the best attorney in the city. Not out of wealth, but out of belief. He never treated it like a favor. He made it clear that Sophie was not just Laura's daughter anymore, she was part of all their lives. The court case took weeks. It was tense, emotional, exhausting. But when it was over, the judge ruled in Laura's favor. The man who had abandoned his responsibilities had no ground to stand on. Sophie was safe. The day they received the verdict, Laura didn't cry. She sat quietly in the courtyard outside the courthouse, with Sophie on her lap and Alexander's hand resting on her shoulder. She looked at the man beside her, who had once been a stranger, and saw the partner she never dared to hope for. Not a savior. Not a fantasy. But a man who had chosen her, chosen Sophie, and chosen the messy, beautiful life they were building, one morning, one meal, one laugh at a time. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Laura and Alexander sat together on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the warm breeze. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I used to think life had to be hard to be real. That if I let it get too easy, it would disappear. But I think maybe I was just too used to pain to recognize peace." He didn't reply right away. He just kissed the top of her head and held her closer. And in that silence, in that small apartment with its chipped paint and second-hand furniture, they found something worth more than anything either of them had ever owned: home. This story's ending carries a rare kind of emotional weight, the kind that doesn't rely on fantasy, but on deeply human growth. What makes it powerful is not that everything ends perfectly, but that every character earns their peace through resilience, humility, and connection. Laura's journey from survival mode to stability is profoundly moving because it's quiet and real. She doesn't become rescued, she's respected. And Alexander's transformation, from a man focused on success to one who learns the value of presence and empathy, shows that redemption doesn't have to be loud or dramatic, it can be steady, even gentle. What stands out most is how love in this story isn't about grand gestures, but about everyday choices, showing up, staying late, listening when it's hard, and choosing family over ego. The ending is satisfying because it feels lived in. It's not a fairy tale, it's better. It's a story about second chances that feels earned. About people who break, bend, and rebuild. And for a world full of uncertainty, that's a kind of happy ending that truly resonates. 3 identical little girls walked into a billionaire's office, handed him a red paper crane, and said, "Mom said you'd understand." He did. And his world unraveled. The morning began like any other for Alexander Weston, CEO of Weston Tech, one of the most powerful and fastest-growing tech corporations in North America. His office, perched high above Manhattan on the 50th floor, gleamed with a minimalistic, modern elegance, glass walls, a pristine white desk, subtle lighting, and an uninterrupted view of the New York skyline. The air smelled faintly of imported Colombian roast and polished wood. He liked his world controlled, clean, and precise. People admired his discipline, feared his mind, and respected his distance. To the world, he was a genius in a tailored suit, a man who had mastered time, risk, and opportunity. But behind all of that brilliance was a fortress carefully built to keep his past where it belonged, in silence. That day, he had just dismissed his assistant with a clipped nod and sat down with his second espresso when something odd happened. The double doors to his office opened quietly, not rushed, not dramatic, but with such calm certainty that it unsettled him before he even looked up. 3 little girls walked in. They were no older than 6. Blonde hair, soft waves that caught the morning light. Eyes so blue, they felt almost surreal, like they weren't real children but sketches brought to life. They were dressed in pale-colored summer dresses, their shoes clean but slightly scuffed at the toes, as though they had walked a long way or wandered without being carried. They didn't speak at first. They simply stood there, still and confident, as though this tower, this office, this man, none of it intimidated them. They looked around only once, and then all 3 turned their gaze to him. Alexander stood up sharply. His instinct, as always, was to take control, to demand answers. But something about the way they looked at him stole the words from his throat. A strange tremor fluttered in his chest. The one in the center, perhaps slightly taller than the other 2, walked forward slowly. She reached into her pocket and held out a small red object, carefully folded, delicate yet precise. A paper crane. The moment it touched his palm, something cracked inside him. The little girl tilted her head slightly, studying his face as though trying to make sure he had received the message. Then, in a soft, clear voice, she said, "Mom said you'd understand." For a moment, nothing made sense. The room felt too quiet. The world tilted, just slightly. He stared at the crane in his hand. Red. Perfectly creased. The exact shade, the exact design. His mind flew back 7 years without his permission, to another hand that once made these birds for him. One woman. The only one who had ever folded them the same way. Lillian. Her name hit him like a train. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. He hadn't let himself think about her, not really. But now, with this red crane burning in his palm and 3 pairs of identical blue eyes watching him like he was supposed to know something, he did. He knew. Deep in his bones. These weren't just children. These were her children. And if he was honest with himself, he already suspected the rest. His fingers tightened around the paper crane. His voice, unused to uncertainty, came out softer than he intended. "Who are you?" he asked, barely recognizing his own tone. One of the girls, maybe the youngest, answered calmly. We're Emma, Grace, and Sophie. He swallowed. Something in the way she said it made his heart sink. And your mother, he managed to say. She's in the hospital, said the first girl again. She said, it's important that you talk to her before it's too late. Alexander Weston, who had once refused to believe in anything he couldn't quantify, fate, love, signs, second chances, felt his carefully built reality begin to unravel. The past had not only returned. It had found a way to stand before him in living form, with small shoes and hopeful eyes. And as he looked at those girls, his girls, though he hadn't earned the right to think of them that way yet, he felt, for the first time in years, truly afraid. Not of failure. Not of scandal. Afraid that he might be too late. He couldn't remember how he got to the elevator. The crane was still in his hand, slightly crumpled from how tightly he was holding it. His phone lay forgotten on his desk, and his assistant's voice calling after him blurred into the background. The only thing he saw clearly were the girls, walking quietly behind him through the marble lobby, attracting puzzled looks from staff and passers-by. But no one stopped them. Somehow, everyone sensed something significant was happening, like the air itself had changed. Outside, the city moved in its usual frantic rhythm. Taxis honked. Tourists took photos. People stared into screens as if the world existed only inside their devices. But to Alexander, the noise had receded into a dull hum. The chaos of New York didn't reach him now. His mind had collapsed into a tunnel focused on one thing, Lillian Hart. The name echoed inside him, sharper than memory. He hadn't heard it aloud in 7 years, hadn't dared to think of her for more than a few seconds at a time. Not because he didn't care, but because caring had felt dangerous. Back then, he'd convinced himself that he had no choice. He was building something enormous. He didn't have time for late-night talks about dreams or spontaneous picnics in the park. He didn't need paper birds or whispered wishes under the stars. He needed results, success, control. He had told himself she would move on. And if there was pain when she stood in his apartment doorway for the last time, her hands trembling as she handed him one final crane, he buried it so deep inside that it could never rise again. But now the paper bird was in his palm once more, and the pain had risen like a flood. He looked at the girls in the back seat of the car. They sat quietly, watching the city roll by. Not fidgeting. Not talking. Just present. There was something eerie in their calm, something that reminded him of Lillian, the quiet intensity, the stillness beneath the surface. The smallest one, Sophie, held another crane in her lap. A blue one this time. She traced its folded wings with her fingers gently, like it was alive. He turned back toward the window, suddenly afraid of what he might say if he kept looking at them. How could he ask the questions screaming inside his head? Did they know who he was? Did Lillian tell them? Did they hate him for not being there? And what kind of man was he, that he didn't even know he had daughters, 3 of them? The hospital wasn't far. Just a few minutes uptown, in a quiet corner of the Upper West Side, nestled between stone buildings and shaded trees. It wasn't flashy or new. It was the kind of place someone chose carefully, someone who didn't want attention but needed trust. The car pulled up, and Emma, the oldest, or at least the most composed, reached for the door handle without waiting for him. The others followed, moving with that same silent understanding that had unnerved him from the start. Inside, the walls were white and still, the lights soft. A nurse greeted them, her eyes flicking with recognition when she saw the girls. Without asking, she said, "Room 216, and nodded toward the elevator. Alexander followed blindly, his chest tightening with every step. Outside the room, he paused. His hand hovered over the door handle, but he couldn't bring himself to push it yet. He glanced at the girls. Grace looked up at him and gave the smallest of nods, not exactly encouraging, just confirming that this moment was real. He stepped inside. The room was dim. A vase of dying lilies sat on the window ledge. The 4 beeped softly in the background. And there she was. Lillian. Her hair was shorter now, her skin paler, but it was her. The curve of her cheek, the way her fingers rested lightly on the blanket, the tilt of her head even in sleep, it all rushed back to him. It was unbearable, this collision between memory and reality. Her body looked fragile, but her presence was still magnetic. She hadn't lost that quiet gravity that used to stop his mind in its tracks. She opened her eyes slowly, and when she saw him, she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It barely touched her lips. But it hit him harder than any accusation could have. "I was starting to think the crane wouldn't make it," she whispered, her voice barely above air. He tried to answer, but his throat had locked. He looked down at the red paper crane still in his hand and then back at her. Her eyes followed the movement, and for a second, they sparkled, not with triumph, not even relief, but something deeper. Something almost like forgiveness. "I didn't know," he said at last, his voice breaking in the middle. "I know," she replied. He pulled the chair closer and sat down. For the first time in years, he didn't care about schedules or headlines or stock prices. He didn't care about how long he had avoided this or why. All that mattered was the woman in front of him and the years between them that neither could take back. "I should have been there," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "But you're here now." And in that moment, surrounded by machines and shadows, with 3 little girls sitting just outside the door, Alexander Weston, once the most calculating man in the city, began to feel something he had forgotten how to recognize. He was beginning to remember what love really looked like. The first night was the hardest. He stayed in the hospital room long after the girls had fallen asleep in the family lounge down the hall. Nurses came and went, adjusting Lillian's 4 or checking her vitals, whispering softly around him as if they knew something sacred was unfolding. He didn't move. He sat in the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped in front of him like he was praying, though he hadn't spoken to any god in decades. The room smelled like antiseptic and lavender soap. The soft beeping of machines was the only rhythm keeping his thoughts from spiraling into panic. Lillian slept, her chest rising and falling with the slow, careful breath of someone whose body was conserving every bit of strength it had left. Occasionally, her lips would twitch, or her brow would furrow, like her dreams were heavier than her frame could carry. He couldn't stop watching her. Every moment felt like a gift he didn't deserve. 7 years gone, and somehow, she looked exactly the same and impossibly different. She was still beautiful, but it was a quieter beauty now, fragile, etched with suffering, yet lit by something that felt like peace. He remembered the last time he saw her, standing in the doorway of his apartment with tears in her eyes and a crane in her hand. He remembered the way she had asked him, just once, to stay, not forever, not even for the night, but just long enough to tell her he still saw her. And he had turned away. He told himself at the time that it was necessary, that his career couldn't afford softness. He was building something too big, too important, and there was no room in it for a woman who folded paper birds and talked about things like fate. What a fool he had been. Now, sitting in that sterile room, the weight of what he had walked away from felt unbearable. And yet, even in that guilt, there was something deeper blooming beneath the pain, an overwhelming sense of responsibility, of clarity. Not just about Lillian, but about the 3 girls who had entered his life so suddenly and completely. His daughters. His daughters. He still couldn't say the words aloud. They felt too big. Too sacred. He had missed their births, their first words, their first steps. He hadn't even known their names until a few hours ago. And yet, when he saw them, he didn't feel like a stranger. He felt something ancient and instinctive rise in him, something that told him they belonged to him and he to them. That somehow, even in his absence, something inside him had been waiting for them all along. Lillian stirred. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a moment she looked at him without speaking, as if she were trying to memorize the shape of his face again after so many years. He shifted closer, afraid to break the moment. "You haven't changed much," she said, her voice rough from sleep but laced with a soft, almost amused sadness. "Still stubborn. Still quiet when it matters." He let out a shaky breath. "You should have told me." Her eyes didn't leave his. "I wanted to. So many times. But every time I thought about it, I pictured you just walking away again. I didn't want the girls to grow up with that kind of silence." "I wouldn't have," he said quickly, then stopped. "No. That's not true. I don't know what I would have done back then. I wasn't ready to hear it. But I should have been. I should have been better." She didn't argue. That was one thing he had always admired about her, she didn't sugarcoat truth. She let it sit between them like a living thing, waiting to be acknowledged. "They asked about you," she said after a moment. "When they were little, they thought maybe you were an astronaut. Or a spy. Or a prince in hiding." His chest tightened. "What did you tell them?" "That you were someone I once loved very much. Someone who made me cranes and made me cry. Someone I hoped they'd meet one day, when they were ready. When you were ready." He didn't deserve that kind of grace. He didn't deserve her. "I don't know how to be a father," he said quietly. "You'll learn," she replied. "They're good girls. Smart. Kind. They already like you, even if they don't understand why yet. Just be present. They'll do the rest." He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his face with both hands, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with time zones or business deals. Everything inside him felt raw and rearranged. "I missed everything," he said finally. Lillian turned her head toward the window. Outside, the lights of the city blinked gently in the darkness. "You missed a lot," she said. "But not everything. You're here now, and I don't know how much time I have left, Alex. But I know this, if you want to know them, really know them, there's still time. They're not angry. They're just waiting. Kids have a way of opening doors we don't even realize are still unlocked." He didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket and carefully smoothed out the red crane the girls had given him earlier. He placed it gently on the windowsill beside the vase of lilies. It stood there, bright against the pale light, a tiny symbol of hope, of a beginning. She watched him do it, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. "Do you remember the first one I gave you?" she asked. He nodded. "Before my first pitch meeting. You said it was for luck. And you closed the deal." "I didn't believe in luck." "No," she said softly. "But I did. And I believed in you." He looked at her, and something in him shifted, something that had been frozen for years finally starting to thaw. "I want to fix this," he whispered. "Then start with them," she said. "Start with the girls. Show them that their father is more than the man who left." And just like that, something changed. Not in the room, not in the air, but in him. A crack in the armor. A sliver of light. A quiet, terrifying, exhilarating sense that it wasn't too late after all. The next morning began in a silence that felt different than the silence of the night before. It wasn't heavy with shock or uncertainty, it was thoughtful, almost reverent, like the world around them was holding its breath. Alexander sat on the small couch in Lillian's hospital room, a blanket over his shoulders that one of the nurses had quietly draped there sometime during the night. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had caught him at last, folding his body forward in a restless, guarded sleep filled with flashes of memories he hadn't visited in years. Now, in the pale light of dawn, he was awake again, eyes fixed on a small cardboard box on the table near Lillian's bed. She was still sleeping, her breath steady and slow, but her presence filled the room even in rest. He didn't touch the box at first. It looked old, the edges frayed and corners dented slightly from being carried and set down and picked up again too many times. There was no label on it, no writing. Just a simple, unassuming box taped shut with a strip of soft pink washi tape, delicate and familiar. It was the kind Lillian used to seal notes and scrapbooks when they were together, a detail that made his chest ache. Finally, as the sun crept over the skyline outside the window, painting the floor with gold, he reached out and pulled the box gently toward him. He peeled away the tape as if it were something sacred, careful not to tear it. The cardboard flaps unfolded with a quiet sigh, and inside, he found what could only be described as a small universe. Dozens upon dozens of paper cranes, all folded in varying shades of red, blue, and soft cream, were stacked inside, organized by color and size. Some had aged and softened with time, their creases a little worn, while others looked nearly new. Beneath them, nestled like buried treasure, were small slips of folded paper, notes. Letters. So many, tied together with simple ribbons, dated in careful handwriting that hadn't changed at all. He pulled one out at random. The date on it was almost 6 years ago. Carefully, he untied the ribbon and unfolded the note. It was short, just a few lines. Today Emma laughed so hard she fell over backward and bumped her head. I kissed her 3 times and she stopped crying. You would have laughed, your crooked smile. You were always good with her kind of chaos. He stared at the words for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. Then he opened another. Sophie won't go to sleep unless I hum that song you used to whistle while working on your laptop. I didn't know she'd heard it enough to remember. I don't even know what it's called. She just says it makes her feel like the stars are close. And another. Grace asked me today why she doesn't have a dad like other kids at school. I told her she has one, she just hasn't met him yet. That he's doing important things, but that maybe one day he'll come find us. I don't know if I said it for her, or for me. Each letter felt like a thread weaving a tapestry he had never seen, yet had been a part of all along. He was a ghost in their lives, but not a villain. Lillian had never painted him in bitterness. She had spoken of him gently, even in his absence. There was grief in the words, yes, and longing, but there was also grace, an impossible, humbling grace he hadn't earned and might never fully deserve. He wasn't sure how long he sat there reading, pulling letter after letter from the box, each one a piece of a life he had never lived but now desperately wanted to understand. There were entries about birthday parties with handmade cakes, about illnesses and bad dreams and favorite bedtime stories. There were sketches in the margins, Grace's first drawing of a tree, Emma's lopsided cat, Sophie's attempt at writing her name. He found a photo tucked between 2 of the cranes, blurry, candid, clearly taken from a distance. The 3 girls sitting on a blanket in the park, a picnic basket beside them, Lillian's hand reaching toward them from off-camera. It was a perfect moment of ordinary beauty. When he looked up, Lillian was awake. She was watching him quietly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were wet. I didn't mean for you to find that so soon, she said softly, her voice hoarse but steady. But maybe it's better you did. I had no idea, he said, and it was all he could manage. It felt pathetic, but it was the truth. I didn't know you were writing to me all these years. That you were still, thinking of me. I wasn't writing to you, she replied. I was writing for them. And maybe a little for myself. I didn't know if you'd ever come back. But I wanted them to have a record of how much they were loved. How much you were part of them, even if you weren't here. His hands tightened around the letters. He had read so many things in his life, contracts, business proposals, legal documents, but none of them had ever felt like this. None had ever made his chest feel too full to breathe. I don't know how to make up for all of this, he whispered. You can't, she said, without malice. You can't rewrite the past, Alex. But you can choose what you do with the present. You can show them who you are now. That matters more than you think. I want to, he said. More than anything. She smiled faintly, a flicker of the woman he used to know shining through the lines fatigue had drawn across her face. Then start with a story. Tonight. Tell them one about you. Not the CEO. Not the man who lives in glass towers. The boy who learned how to fold a crane because he was trying to impress a girl. He laughed, quietly, the sound unfamiliar in this setting, but not unwelcome. And for the first time, he saw a future, blurry and distant, but real. A future where he could sit at a table with 3 little girls and fold paper cranes with clumsy fingers and tell stories that had nothing to do with money or markets. That night, when the girls came to visit again, he didn't sit stiffly in the corner like he had before. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the floor with them, a paper square in hand, and said, "Let me show you something your mom taught me a long time ago." And as his fingers folded the paper slowly, awkwardly, the girls leaned in, their eyes wide, and a new chapter of their lives quietly began, one made not of apologies, but of presence. The following days passed in a strange rhythm that Alexander had never experienced before. It was nothing like the precision and intensity of boardrooms or investor meetings, where every second was calculated, every word rehearsed, and outcomes were tracked like stock values. This was something entirely different, messier, slower, quieter, but deeper in a way that unsettled and steadied him all at once. He began spending more time at the hospital, arriving early in the mornings before the nurses had changed shifts and leaving only when the girls' eyelids began to flutter with sleep. His phone rang less and less as the hours went by, and eventually, he stopped looking at it altogether. At some point, without announcing it to anyone, he had told his assistant to cancel his upcoming meetings, postpone his travel plans, and pause his role at Weston Tech, whatever that meant in a world where CEOs were expected to exist in 24-hour cycles. The truth was, he didn't care. He didn't want to be the man whose name appeared in headlines anymore. He wanted to be someone whose name meant something at home. Each day brought small, sacred moments, firsts that shouldn't have felt like firsts, but somehow did. He learned how Emma liked her apple slices with the skin peeled off because it's softer that way, and how Grace insisted on carrying her own bag even though it was too big for her shoulders, because I'm the big sister. Sophie, the quietest of the 3, had the strongest opinions when she did speak, and he quickly realized she was the most like Lillian, observant, stubborn in the gentlest way, and frighteningly intuitive. She seemed to watch him not just with her eyes, but with something else, something that weighed his intentions. He wanted to earn her trust, not with gifts or promises, but with time. Time he should have given from the beginning. Lillian was still weak, her body ravaged by the slow, unforgiving illness that had taken so much from her, but she never complained. She rested more during the day, her strength waning, and Alexander took over the space that had always been hers, reading to the girls, packing snacks, asking the nurses questions with growing urgency and knowledge. He stopped dressing like a mogul. His sharp suits gave way to soft sweaters and rolled-up sleeves. He started folding cranes again, every night, one for each of the girls. They kept them in their backpacks or under their pillows, tiny symbols of something neither of them could fully explain but all instinctively understood. One morning, as he sat beside Lillian, he told her something he hadn't said to anyone else. "I've been thinking about leaving the company," he said, not looking at her as he spoke, afraid of what her eyes might reveal. Not just a sabbatical. Really leaving. Giving it up. She was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally turned to face her, she didn't look shocked or worried. She looked calm. Almost relieved. "I wondered when you'd say that," she murmured. "I'm not surprised." "You're not?" "No. Because this version of you, the one I'm looking at right now, isn't built for boardrooms anymore. You've changed. I don't know if that's good or bad." "It's real," she said. "And it's what they need. It's what you need, too." He let the silence sit between them for a while. Outside the window, spring had started to make itself known. The trees on the avenue were budding with tentative green, and the sky was the kind of blue that made everything underneath it feel more possible. I missed so much, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed. But now you have a choice. You can either spend your time regretting the past or spend it building something now. That night, he made his choice. He sat the girls down after dinner, all three of them crowded onto the small pull-out sofa in the hospital's family room, legs tucked under them, their attention bouncing between curiosity and excitement. He didn't use a whiteboard or a slideshow. He didn't explain it like a press conference. He just told them a story, his story. He told them about a boy who was so afraid of failure that he built walls instead of bridges. A boy who chased success until he forgot why he wanted it in the first place. And then he told them how that boy met a girl who folded paper cranes and laughed at his need to be perfect. A girl who taught him how to breathe. And how, when he left her, he thought he had made the smart choice. But years later, 3 little girls walked into his office carrying a red crane and changed everything. They listened, wide-eyed, their heads tilted at the same identical angle that made his chest ache with how much of her lived in them. And when he finished, Sophie climbed into his lap without saying a word and curled into him like she had been doing it her whole life. Later that week, he wrote an official letter of resignation. The board didn't understand. Investors panicked. Headlines speculated. Tech titan walks away from empire. But Alexander didn't read any of them. He was too busy walking Sophie to her preschool classroom for the first time, holding Emma's hand through her fear of losing her first tooth, and helping Grace memorize lines for a school play. He wasn't just trying to be part of their lives now. He was trying to build one with them. And every evening, when he returned to the hospital to sit with Lillian, he folded a new crane, handed it to her, and said, "Today I got it a little more right." And she would smile, tuck it into the growing pile on her nightstand, and whisper, one at a time. April arrived with a kind of deceptive beauty that made the waiting harder. The sky turned brighter, the air softer, and Central Park slowly turned green again, as though nothing in the world could go wrong beneath such a gentle season. But inside the hospital, beneath the warm sunlight filtering through half-open blinds, Lillian was getting worse. At first, the signs were subtle. She grew tired more easily, her words sometimes trailed off mid-sentence, and her appetite, already fragile, all but disappeared. She smiled for the girls, made jokes for Alexander, but when she thought no one was watching, her shoulders slumped and her breathing slowed as if each movement required calculation and restraint. The light in her eyes dimmed slightly every day. Alexander saw it all. He tried not to show it, but the change in him was immediate. He began reading medical journals late at night, consulting with specialists on other continents, funding private research programs at a rate that made his former financial advisors uneasy. He no longer thought in terms of budgets or forecasts. He thought in hours. In minutes. In moments he hadn't had and ones he might still be able to save. He was in the hallway with one of Lillian's doctors when the news came. The specialist, a calm, pragmatic woman with eyes too weary for her age, explained in the quietest, most respectful voice that Lillian's disease had entered an accelerated stage. Time, she said, was not on their side. The treatment that had been helping her slow its progression had stopped working. They could try stronger medication, but it came with severe side effects. One option remained, a rare stem cell-based therapy undergoing clinical trials abroad, available only to patients with a close genetic match willing to donate. The science was new, experimental, but it had shown signs of promise in a handful of cases. The catch was clear: it would require a donor, and the only likely candidates were immediate blood relatives. When Alexander returned to Lillian's room, he didn't speak of it right away. She was asleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest shallow but steady. Her skin looked nearly translucent against the pillow, and yet, even in this state, she radiated that same quiet strength. The same unspoken grace that had always drawn him in without effort. He sat beside her for a long time, one hand wrapped around hers, the other resting on the paper crane he had brought that day. It was yellow. A color she once told him reminded her of morning hope. The next day, he had the girls tested. He didn't explain the full details to them, how could he? They were only 6, still wrapping their heads around the idea of hospitals and illness and what it meant when their mother slept for most of the day. But he spoke gently, honestly, sitting cross-legged on the rug with them while cartoons played quietly in the background. He said the doctors needed to see if their blood could help their mom feel better. That it would mean a little poke, maybe a small test. Emma asked first, "Will it hurt?" and Alexander said, "A little. But it's for something really important." Grace, always the quiet listener, simply nodded, while Sophie took his hand and said, "If it helps her stay longer, then okay." When the results came back, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks: hope. Grace was a perfect match. A miracle, the doctor said. In cases like these, it was extremely rare to find such compatibility, even among family. But somehow, Grace's markers aligned perfectly with what they needed. What followed was one of the hardest conversations of his life. He and Lillian sat together in her room, sunlight pouring in, and he told her everything. Her first instinct was to say no. She couldn't imagine her daughter undergoing a procedure for her sake. The risk was low, the doctors had explained, but it was still invasive. Still frightening. Still unknown. She gripped Alexander's hand with what strength she had and said, "She's too young. She shouldn't have to be brave for me." But Alexander, gently and with tears in his eyes, said something she hadn't expected. "She's already brave. All 3 of them are. And this isn't just about survival anymore. It's about giving them more time with you, memories that they'll carry longer than the stories I tell them. I think Grace understands more than either of us expected." They waited a full day before speaking to Grace again. This time, both parents together. They spoke slowly, carefully, not hiding the seriousness but not overburdening her with fear. And Grace, after listening silently, climbed up on the bed beside her mother and said, "If it gives you more good days, then I want to do it." The hospital moved quickly after that. Alexander flew in a specialist team from Europe. They converted one of the unused hospital suites into a makeshift recovery space just for Grace, decorating it with her favorite books and soft pillows and a window that looked out over the river. He stayed with her through every test, every explanation, every blood draw. He learned how to braid her hair the way she liked it and brought her small surprises: colored pencils, a stuffed lion, a pink paper crane he folded on his own. He'd never folded pink before, but she loved it. The procedure happened in the 3rd week of April. The doctors didn't sugarcoat the anxiety, they explained the risks, prepared for complications. But everything went smoothly. Grace was strong. She bounced back quicker than expected, demanding cookies and orange juice before the nurses even finished disconnecting the final tubes. Alexander wept in the hallway afterward, not because something had gone wrong, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, something had gone right. Lillian's recovery was slower. The infusion was just the beginning. Her immune system needed time to adjust, and her body was still weak. But within days, the changes were visible. Her eyes grew clearer. Her appetite returned in small but meaningful ways. She could sit up without assistance. Then she could walk across the room with Alexander's arm beneath hers. The nurses began calling her the miracle patient, and while Alexander hated the word, it sounded too much like luck and not enough like choice, he understood what they meant. One evening, about 10 days after the transplant, the whole family sat together in the hospital garden. The girls were drawing chalk hearts on the stone walkway, and Lillian was wrapped in a blanket on a bench, watching them with a serenity that made the air itself feel warmer. Alexander sat beside her, their hands loosely entwined. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. And when she finally turned to him, her eyes filled with tears but her voice steady, she whispered, "You saved me." He shook his head and kissed the back of her hand. "No. Grace saved you. And you saved me long before that. I'm just finally trying to be the man you believed I could be." She rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, they sat without any urgency, without fear, simply existing together. The future was still uncertain. It always would be. But in that moment, surrounded by chalk drawings and warm spring air, they weren't thinking about endings anymore. They were thinking about what could begin. May brought with it a kind of slow magic that Alexander hadn't known he needed. It didn't come in grand gestures or earth-shaking declarations. It came in the quiet, steady rhythm of healing. In Lillian's voice gaining strength one sentence at a time. In the color returning to her cheeks. In the way she walked now, carefully, but without help. The hospital room that had once been a place of waiting and uncertainty transformed into something softer, more like a temporary home, filled with laughter and paper cranes and the smell of apple juice and colored pencils. The girls were there every day after school, curled up on the bed with Lillian, bringing her drawings and stories and questions about things as small as ant colonies and as big as outer space. They talked to her the way only children do, with complete faith that their mother would always be there to answer. By the end of the month, the doctors agreed Lillian could be discharged to finish her recovery at home. It felt surreal to hear those words, home. For a long time, Alexander didn't even know what that meant anymore. He had houses, sure, 3 of them, across different cities, but he hadn't lived in any of them. Not truly. They had been places to sleep, to host meetings, to impress investors. But now he was planning for something different. Something real. He had found a small house just outside the city, tucked away near a lake, quiet and surrounded by trees. It wasn't modern or flashy. It didn't have smart walls or a wine cellar or a private elevator. But it had light. And space. And rooms where the girls could paint the walls whatever colors they wanted. A place with a front porch for rainy days and a backyard big enough to chase fireflies. Lillian had seen the pictures and simply nodded, a tear running down her cheek. It was exactly the kind of place she would have chosen. Moving day was small and beautiful. There were no moving trucks or corporate decorators, just a modest car, a few bags, and the 5 of them holding hands as they stepped across the threshold into a future none of them had expected but all of them now fiercely wanted. The first night, Alexander cooked. It was a disaster, overcooked pasta, a smoke alarm, spilled sauce on the floor, but the girls loved every second of it. They giggled until their stomachs hurt and Lillian, still weak but radiant in her laughter, declared it the best worst dinner she'd ever had. There were no official schedules, no perfectly laid out plans. But slowly, a routine began to form. Morning started with the smell of toast and the sound of feet running down the hall. Alexander learned to pack lunches. He drove them to school, one arm out the window, the other adjusting the rearview mirror to catch their faces. Lillian rested more at first, but as her strength returned, she joined him in small moments, brushing Emma's hair, helping Grace with homework, sitting with Sophie in the garden as she tried to count butterflies. Alexander didn't return to the tech world. Not even in whispers. He didn't host Zoom calls from the kitchen or sneak away to answer emails in the middle of bedtime stories. His old life, so precise, so performative, felt 1,000 years away. Occasionally, someone from Weston Tech would reach out. A board member asking if he wanted to stay on in an advisory role, or a reporter requesting an interview about his sabbatical. He ignored all of it. What he was doing now mattered more than anything he'd ever built with stock or code. One afternoon, he found Lillian in the backyard, sitting barefoot in the grass with a sketchbook in her lap and a cup of tea in her hand. She was drawing the girls. From memory. From motion. From the heart. The lines were loose and soft, alive with movement, and when she looked up at him, he saw that she was drawing again not just with her hands, but with her whole soul. That light was back, the one he had fallen in love with years ago, the one he had walked away from but never forgotten. He sat beside her and didn't say anything for a long time. Just listened to the wind in the trees, the distant laughter of the girls building a fort out of branches, and the heartbeat of a life he never thought he would be allowed to have. Later that evening, Lillian joined him on the porch. She brought out a small jar filled with folded cranes, different sizes, different colors, some crisp and perfect, others rumpled and obviously made by tiny hands. She set the jar on the table between them and said, "I told them every crane is a wish." So they started folding them too. He smiled, picking one up. It was pale blue, folded unevenly, but still beautiful. "What are they wishing for?" "Everything," she said. "Long summers. Nighttime stories. That their dad never stops folding cranes." He looked out at the lake, the reflection of the moon floating quietly across the surface, and something in his chest relaxed for the first time in years. He didn't feel like a man rebuilding his life anymore. He felt like a man living it. That night, after the girls were tucked in and the house had fallen into a peaceful hush, he sat alone in the kitchen with a piece of red paper and folded a crane by memory. He placed it next to the others, but not in the jar. He left it on the windowsill, where the morning sun would touch it first. A silent promise. A reminder. This wasn't luck. This was love, lived on purpose. This was healing, earned one moment at a time. A full year passed, though it didn't feel like 12 months had gone by. It felt like something else entirely, like time had taken on a different texture. It didn't race forward the way it used to in boardrooms and airport lounges. It didn't vanish into emails and meetings and bottom lines. It unfolded. Slowly. Steadily. Purposefully. One morning into the next. One bedtime story into another. The rhythm of life in the Westenhart household had settled into something quiet and sacred. The girls were taller now, their voices stronger and their questions more complex. Grace had developed a love for reading chapter books on her own and was currently obsessed with stories about explorers and maps. Emma had joined a local kids' science club and insisted on mixing strange potions in the kitchen with plastic test tubes. Sophie, ever observant, had started painting beside her mother, watching Lillian's hand with quiet reverence, then imitating her strokes on her own canvas with remarkable skill for her age. Lillian was stronger too. Her health had stabilized far beyond what doctors had predicted. There were still follow-ups, regular tests, and careful monitoring, but she was no longer a patient. She was a mother again. A partner. A woman who could walk through her garden barefoot at sunrise with a coffee in hand and a sketchbook tucked under her arm. Her laughter had become a common sound in the house, and her presence no longer carried the weight of fear. It carried warmth. Presence. Continuity. Alexander had changed most of all. People in town now knew him simply as Alex. Not Mr. Weston. Not the CEO. Just the man who picked up his daughters from school and volunteered to help build birdhouses for the local nature reserve. He no longer wore suits. He no longer talked about acquisitions. He had taken up woodworking, not because he was good at it, but because it allowed him to make things with his hands instead of a keyboard. He made a bookshelf for Grace, a toy chest for Sophie, and a dollhouse for Emma that took him 2 months but became her most treasured possession. He was the man who read out loud at bedtime, who fixed squeaky doors, who sometimes burned breakfast but always served it with a smile. One evening in early June, as twilight softened the sky, Lillian gathered the family in the yard. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lilacs, and the girls had just returned from picking wildflowers along the edge of the lake. They were barefoot and sun-kissed, streaked with dirt and happiness, their arms full of color. Lillian held a large box in her hands, wrapped in fabric instead of paper, and inside it were 100 paper cranes. Each folded by the family over the course of the year, some tiny and fragile, others large and creased with pride. They were every color imaginable, every kind of fold, the careful, the imperfect, the experimental. Each one had a date, a name, or a memory scribbled inside its wing. It wasn't something they had planned. It had just happened. One at a time, one day at a time. "We're going to send them," Lillian said softly, looking around at her family. "Every wish. Every moment. Every lesson we learned. She had prepared a small floating lantern for each crane, light, biodegradable, carefully tied with fishing wire to make sure the cranes would stay safe and upright. Alexander helped light the lanterns, and the girls placed the cranes one by one, whispering things as they did. Some were prayers. Some were secrets. Some were just giggles. Then they carried the lanterns to the edge of the water. The sky was dark enough now to reflect the stars, and the lake was still. They released the cranes together, watching as they drifted out slowly, a trail of soft light and hope moving away from the shore. It wasn't just beautiful. It was profound. It was a letting go, not of the past, but of the pain that once came with it. A celebration of how far they had come. Of what they had chosen to build together. After the last crane had floated far enough that its light was only a flicker, Grace turned to Alexander and asked the question he hadn't expected. "Do you ever miss your company?" He looked down at her, this girl who had once saved her mother's life, who had quietly become the heartbeat of their new world, and smiled. "I used to think Weston Tech was the most important thing I would ever build," he said. "But then I met you. And now I know better." Lillian took his hand. Emma leaned against his side. Sophie hugged his arm and closed her eyes, breathing deeply like she was memorizing the moment. They stood like that for a long while, saying nothing, watching the water glow with the last of the lanterns, surrounded by the silence of things finally set right. Inside the house, above the fireplace, there was a new shelf, simple, hand-carved, slightly uneven. On it stood just one object. A single red paper crane, carefully protected in a glass dome. The one that started everything. The one that had walked back into his life held in the tiny hand of a girl he didn't yet know was his daughter. Below the crane, engraved into a small wooden plaque, were 4 words. "She said you'd understand." And now, he did. Completely. This story, at its core, is not about regret, it's about redemption. It's about how time lost can never be reclaimed, but meaning can still be made in the time we have left. What makes the ending powerful is its quietness. There's no grand finale, no cinematic explosion of drama. Instead, there is something much rarer, peace earned slowly, love rebuilt carefully, and healing that doesn't erase the scars but honors them. The red paper crane becomes more than a symbol. It's a message across years, a reminder that some love doesn't disappear, it waits, quietly, patiently, until we are ready to return to it. Alexander's transformation isn't about abandoning success. It's about redefining it. He doesn't lose his identity, he reclaims a truer one. What I love most is that this story doesn't offer a fantasy escape. It offers a possible reality. It dares to suggest that people can change, that second chances don't always come wrapped in perfection, and that the softest victories, like a little girl's forgiveness or a quiet family dinner, are often the most profound. It doesn't ask if we can go back. It asks something braver. What will you do with the time you have now?